The massive crystal chamber of the Galactic Council hummed with tension as representatives from 47 different species gathered for an emergency session. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the human delegations table and watched the chaos unfold around him. The year was 2387, and Earth had been part of this galactic community for over a century, but today felt different. Today felt like an ending. Dr. Lisa Warren sat beside him with her tablet showing disturbing images from the Outer Rim territories. The pictures were hard to look at but impossible to ignore. Entire Kalari colonies had been burned to ash. The tree-like beings who had lived peacefully for thousands of years were being systematically destroyed by Zephyrian war fleets. Commander Rick Stone shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he reviewed casualty reports that grew worse by the hour. Senator Claire Adams had been trying to build support among other council members for the past 3 days, but the responses were always the same. The Pentarians worried about trade disruptions. The Altarians spoke of territorial sovereignty. The hegemony representatives simply laughed and said some species were meant to disappear. None of them seemed to care that an entire civilization was dying while they debated economic policies. The Kalari ambassador stood in the center of the chamber with his bark-like skin showing stress patterns that resembled deep scars. His voice carried across the vast space as he pleaded for help. His people had no weapons to fight back against the Zephyrian invasion. They had trusted in council protection for generations. Now that protection meant nothing more than empty words and bureaucratic delays. Jake Morrison had seen enough wars to know what genocide looked like. The Zephyrians were not just conquering territory, they were erasing an entire species from existence. Their plasma weapons turned Kalari cities into glass craters. Their ground forces hunted down survivors with methodical efficiency. The Council had satellite feeds showing all of this happening in real time, yet they continued to debate procedure and protocol. Supreme Counselor Mordan called for order as the chamber erupted in arguments. The Zephyrian representative stood with obvious pride as he defended his empire's actions. He claimed the Kalari territories contained valuable mining rights that belonged to stronger species. He said weakness deserved no protection in a universe where only power mattered. Several council members nodded in agreement, while others looked away in shame. Dr. Warren accessed her files and displayed population projections on the main viewing screen. The numbers were stark and terrifying. At current rates of destruction, the Kalari species would be extinct within 6 months. Every day of delay meant thousands more deaths. Every hour of debate cost innocent lives. The mathematical certainty of extinction hung over the chamber like a death sentence. The voting began with predictable results. The hegemony voted against intervention, claiming it would set dangerous precedents. The Pentarian Trade Federation abstained because Zephyrian space controlled 3 major shipping routes. The Altarian Republic voted against action, citing respect for territorial boundaries. Species after species found reasons to abandon the Kalari to their fate. Commander. Stone watched his tactical displays showing Zephyrian fleet movements. The enemy was already moving toward the next Kalari world. Their invasion schedule proceeded without any concern for council deliberations. They knew the political reality better than most council members did. They understood that profit and convenience would always triumph over justice and compassion in this chamber. Senator Adams made one final attempt to build a coalition of smaller species, but the voting power remained with the major civilizations. The minor worlds that supported intervention lacked the political strength to change anything. The mathematics of democracy worked against the Kalari just as surely as Zephyrian weapons did. Jake Morrison requested permission to address the full council. His voice carried the weight of over a century of human participation in galactic affairs. He presented evidence of war crimes that violated every treaty the council had ever signed. He showed footage of Zephyrian forces targeting refugee camps and medical facilities. He offered human military support for a joint intervention force. The response came swiftly and brutally. Counselor Vexistar of the Hegemony stood with a cruel smile spreading across his scaled features. His words cut through the chamber like a blade. Humans were too emotional, he said. Some species simply faded into history as part of natural order. The strong survived while the weak disappeared. This was how the universe worked and always had worked. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone present. Jake Morrison looked around the chamber at representatives who had worked with humans for generations. He saw fear in some faces and greed in others. He saw the cold calculation that valued trade routes over lives and convenience over conscience. Doctor. Warren closed her files knowing that all her research and evidence meant nothing to these people. Commander Stone began calculating human fleet positions in nearby systems. Senator Adams realized that political solutions had reached their end. The Kalari ambassador waited for an answer that would never come. Jake Morrison stood slowly and spoke in a voice that carried absolute finality. Humanity withdrew its motion for intervention. They would handle this matter themselves. The chamber erupted in confusion as the human delegation gathered their materials and walked toward the exit. Behind them, the council continued its debate about procedures and protocols, while another species moved closer to extinction. The journey back to Earth felt longer than usual, despite the advanced jump drive technology that made interstellar travel routine. Jake Morrison stared out at the stars streaming past the viewport and thought about all the times humanity had trusted the council to do the right thing. Each memory felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The Andromedan plague that killed millions while the council debated quarantine procedures. The refugee crisis in the outer spiral that went ignored for 3 years. The mining disasters that could have been prevented with proper safety regulations. General Ben Carter was waiting when the human delegation arrived at Earth Central Command. His weathered face showed the strain of coordinating defensive preparations. Across human space, reports were flooding in from every sector as human colonies prepared for potential retaliation. The Council had never taken kindly to defiance, and humanity was about to commit the ultimate act of rebellion. Admiral Kate Johnson stood beside a massive holographic display showing the positions of every human fleet in known space. Her tactical mind was already working through the logistics of what came next. Recalling every ambassador and trade representative would require careful coordination. Shutting down human-operated infrastructure across Council space would need perfect timing. The operation would be the largest evacuation in galactic history. Dr. Paul Harrison had spent the past week analyzing human contributions to galactic civilization. The numbers were staggering even to him. Human-designed medical technology kept dozens of species alive. Human engineering maintained most of the major trade routes. Human agricultural techniques fed billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Human defensive systems protected colonies that had never bothered to develop their own military capabilities. The Global Assembly convened in emergency session as Jake Morrison delivered his report. The chamber fell silent as he described the Council's final betrayal. The casual dismissal of genocide. The smug superiority of species who valued profit over principles. The complete absence of moral leadership in a galaxy that desperately needed guidance. The assembled representatives listened with growing anger as the full scope of Council corruption became clear. Dr. Lisa Warren presented her analysis of human involvement in galactic affairs. Every medical breakthrough that had been shared freely. Every technological advance that had been given without patent restrictions. Every scientific discovery that had benefited all species equally. Humanity had poured its best efforts into building a better galaxy and received nothing but contempt in return. The vote was unanimous without a single dissenting voice. Humanity would withdraw completely from the Galactic Council, not just politically, but economically and technologically as well. Every human citizen would be recalled from Council space. Every trade agreement would be terminated. Every defensive pact would be canceled. Every research collaboration would end immediately. Admiral Johnson began implementing Operation Homecoming within hours of the vote. human merchant vessels received priority navigation through jump gates as they headed home. Diplomatic missions started destroying sensitive documents and preparing for evacuation. Military advisors assigned to alien forces began withdrawing quietly from their positions. The first shock waves hit Council space when human-operated jump gates went offline. Trade routes that had functioned smoothly for decades suddenly became impassable. Merchant fleets found themselves stranded in deep space without navigation support. Communication networks that relied on human relay stations began failing as technicians abandoned their posts. Commander Rick Stone coordinated the military withdrawal with precision that impressed even his own officers. Human defensive installations powered down their shields and weapon systems. Patrol fleets that had protected alien colonies for generations began their journey home. Military bases that had served as forward operating posts for Council forces started evacuation procedures. Dr. Harrison supervised the recall of human scientific personnel from research stations across the galaxy. Breakthrough experiments were suspended mid-process. Joint research projects that had run for decades suddenly lost their human participants. Medical facilities that relied on human expertise began facing critical shortages as doctors and nurses received evacuation orders. The Council initially dismissed the human withdrawal as a temporary tantrum. Supreme Counselor Mordan issued a statement expressing confidence that humanity would return when they came to their senses. Other representatives spoke of teaching humans a lesson about galactic realities. The hegemony ambassador suggested that human absence would make Council decisions much easier. Senator Claire Adams led the final human delegation to deliver the formal withdrawal notice. The document was brief and professional, but its implications were staggering. Humanity was severing all official ties with the Galactic Council. All treaties were void. All agreements were canceled. All cooperative arrangements would end within 30 standard days. The Kalari ambassador approached the human delegation as they prepared to leave the council chambers forever. His tree-like features showed deep stress patterns as he spoke about his people's desperate situation. The Zephyrian advance continued while the council debated meaningless resolutions. His species had maybe weeks left before complete extinction. Jake. Morrison looked at the Kalari representative with genuine sadness. Humanity could not save everyone, but they would not abandon those who truly needed help. He spoke quietly about sanctuary in human space, about worlds that could be modified for Kalari physiology, about a new beginning far from council politics and corruption. The evacuation accelerated as reports came in of council members trying to seize human assets before they could be removed. Pentarian forces attempted to blockade human-operated mining facilities. Altarian ships moved to intercept human research vessels. The hegemony began demanding compensation for disrupted trade relationships. Admiral Johnson responded with surgical precision. Human warships appeared wherever council forces threatened human citizens or property. The aliens discovered that human military technology had advanced far beyond what they knew. Ship designs that seemed familiar proved to have capabilities that shocked enemy commanders. Defensive systems that looked standard revealed revolutionary improvements. Dr. Warren worked frantically to establish new research facilities in human space. Laboratories that had been scattered across the galaxy needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Scientists who had spent decades working with alien colleagues would have to adjust to purely human teams. Research projects that required alien biology or chemistry would have to be abandoned or completely redesigned. The first refugee ships began arriving from Kalari space as human rescue operations moved into high gear. The tree-like beings required specialized environmental controls that human engineers scrambled to provide. Their dietary needs were complex, and their cultural practices were completely foreign, yet human medical teams worked around the clock to ensure their survival. General Carter monitored Council reactions as the withdrawal accelerated. Some species were beginning to panic as they realized how dependent they had become on human support. Others remained defiant and spoke of replacing human contributions with their own capabilities. A few forward-thinking representatives quietly began reaching out through unofficial channels. The last human ships departed Council space exactly 30 days after the withdrawal notice was delivered. Behind them, they left a galaxy that was about to discover the true cost of dismissing human compassion as weakness. The Council chambers fell silent as representatives began to understand what they had lost through their own arrogance and greed. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Kalari territory like a force of nature. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the HSS Liberation and watched his tactical displays light up with enemy contacts. Zephyrian battle. Groups had surrounded the remaining Kalari worlds in a tightening noose of destruction. Their plasma cannons were already beginning orbital bombardment of the largest population centers. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Taylor checked his assault plans, one final time as his Marines prepared for immediate deployment. The Zephyrians had landed ground forces on 3 Kalari worlds and were systematically hunting down survivors. Human drop pods would need to insert directly into combat zones to establish evacuation corridors. The enemy would not expect such aggressive tactics from a species they considered weak and emotional. Dr. Nina Cross worked frantically in the medical bay to prepare treatment protocols for Kalari refugees. Their physiology was unlike anything human doctors had encountered before. Their bark-like skin could photosynthesize nutrients from starlight, but required specific mineral supplements to maintain cellular integrity. Their root-like feet needed constant moisture, or they would begin to calcify and die. Captain Troy Walsh commanded the escort fleet that would protect the evacuation transports during their dangerous journey. His ships carried experimental defensive systems that had never been tested in actual combat. The Council had refused to share advanced military technology with humanity for decades. Now they would discover what human engineers had accomplished, working in isolation. The first rescue ships approached Kalari Prime as Zephyrian interceptors moved to block their path. The enemy expected standard Council tactics involving lengthy negotiations and careful positioning. Instead, they faced human warships that opened fire without warning and closed to point-blank range with terrifying speed. Zephyrian captains who had dominated battlefields for generations suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Elder Silandros waited in the ruins of his capital city as human transport craft descended through clouds of smoke and debris. His people had trusted the Council for protection that never came. Now, aliens from a species they barely knew were risking their lives to save them. The contradiction seemed impossible to understand, yet the evidence surrounded him as human soldiers, established defensive perimeters. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency that amazed even the humans involved. Dr. Cross had modified standard transport ships to accommodate Kalari environmental needs within hours of receiving the mission. Parameters. Specialized atmospheric processors maintained the precise humidity and mineral content that Kalari physiology required. Medical teams stood ready to treat injuries that human medicine had never seen before. Sam Taylor led his Marines through the burning streets of the Kalari capital as they searched for survivors. The tree-like beings were naturally peaceful and had no experience with warfare. Many were hiding in underground root systems that their ancestors had grown over centuries. Human thermal scanners could detect their biosignatures even through meters of living wood and earth. The Zephyrian ground commander was furious as human forces disrupted his systematic extermination campaign. His troops had been methodically burning Kalari cities block by block. Now human soldiers were extracting survivors from areas he had already declared cleared. Their advanced equipment and aggressive tactics were completely unexpected from a species known for diplomatic solutions. Captain Walsh watched his tactical displays as more Zephyrian reinforcements dropped out of hyperspace. The enemy was bringing heavy battle cruisers equipped with planet-killing weapons. Human escort vessels would be outnumbered 3-1 once the enemy fleet reached full strength. The evacuation timetable would have to be accelerated regardless of safety protocols. Dr. Cross worked around the clock as Kalari refugees filled the transport ships beyond recommended capacity. Their injuries were unlike anything in human medical databases. Plasma burns had partially carbonized their bark-like skin. Dehydration caused their root systems to shrivel and blacken. Psychological trauma manifested as a complete shutdown of their photosynthetic processes. The Battle of Kalari Prime began when Zephyrian heavy units engaged the human escort fleet in orbit above the dying world. Enemy commanders expected to sweep aside the small human force with overwhelming firepower. Instead, they discovered that human ships carried weapons systems decades ahead of anything in Council space. Quantum torpedoes punched through energy shields that had been considered impenetrable. Jake Morrison coordinated the battle from the Liberation as his fleet demonstrated tactical innovations that shocked the enemy. Human ships fought in perfect synchronization using artificial intelligence networks that allowed instant communication and coordination. Individual vessels could predict the actions of their squadmates and respond to threats that had not yet materialized. Troy Walsh led his destroyers in a desperate charge against the Zephyrian flagship as evacuation transports struggled to escape. The Gravity Well. His ships used adaptive shielding that changed configuration in real time to counter specific weapon types. The enemy found that their standard plasma cannons were completely ineffective against defensive systems that evolved during combat. The Kalari refugees watched from transport viewports as human warships sacrificed themselves to ensure their escape. Many of the tree-like beings had never seen military combat before. The concept of strangers dying to protect them was completely foreign to their peaceful culture. Yet human crews continued fighting even when their ships were heavily damaged and their survival was uncertain. Sam Taylor's Marines provided rearguard action as the last evacuation shuttles lifted off from Kalari Prime. Zephyrian ground forces were advancing with heavy armor and artillery support. Human soldiers used portable energy shields and advanced small arms to hold defensive positions that should have been overrun within minutes. Their equipment gave them capabilities that ground-based enemies could not match. Dr. Cross watched the final medical statistics as the last Kalari survivors were brought aboard. 98% of the species had been successfully evacuated from their dying homeworld. The number was far higher than anyone had dared hope when the rescue mission began. Human medical technology and logistical planning had achieved what the Council considered impossible. The evacuation fleet departed Kalari space as Zephyrian reinforcements arrived to find their prize already gone. The enemy had expected to complete their genocide without interference. Instead, they discovered empty cities and abandoned colonies. The species they had intended to destroy was safely beyond their reach in human-controlled territory. Elder Sil Andros stood in the observation deck of a human transport ship and watched his home world shrink into the distance. Zephyrian orbital. Bombardment was turning the surface into molten glass. Forests that had grown for thousands of years were being reduced to ash and carbon. Yet his people were alive because strangers had chosen to act when their own allies had failed them. So, journey to human space took several days as the refugee fleet navigated through territory that was no longer protected by Council forces. Human worlds prepared to receive millions of beings whose environmental needs were completely different from their own. Entire planets would need to be terraformed to accommodate Kalari physiology and culture. Jake Morrison filed his final report as the fleet crossed into human territory. The rescue operation had cost dozens of ships and hundreds of lives. Yet the alternative had been watching an entire species face extinction while bureaucrats debated political consequences. The choice had been clear even if the Council could not see it. 6 months after humanity vanished from Council space, the first cracks began showing in the galactic economy. Councillor Thelvanus of the Altarian Republic stared at trade reports that painted a picture of spreading chaos. Shipping routes that had operated smoothly for decades were now plagued by pirate attacks and navigation failures. The human-maintained Jumpgate network had collapsed, leaving entire sectors isolated from galactic commerce. Trade Minister Zorketh reviewed financial projections that grew more catastrophic with each passing day. The Pentarian Trade Federation faced complete economic collapse as their business model had depended entirely on processing and distributing human-manufactured goods. Factories across Pentarian space sat empty because their assembly lines were designed for components that no longer existed. Millions of workers faced unemployment as entire industries simply vanished overnight. Supreme Councillor Mordan tried to maintain confidence during emergency sessions, but the scope of the crisis was becoming impossible to hide. Medical emergencies were erupting across dozens of worlds as human-designed pharmaceuticals ran out of stock. Hospitals that had relied on human organ regeneration technology watched patients die from conditions that had been easily treatable just months before. The universal vaccines that Dr. Warren had developed were no longer being produced anywhere in Council space. The hegemony military discovered that their defensive networks were failing without human technical support. Weapon systems that had seemed purely alien-designed actually contained critical human components that required regular maintenance. Shield generators were shutting down one by one as replacement parts became impossible to obtain. Fleet commanders, who had dismissed human military capabilities, found their own ships becoming inoperable. Councillor Thelvanus attempted to reach out to Earth through unofficial diplomatic channels, but received automated responses that redirected all communications to official protocols. Humanity no longer recognized the Council as a legitimate governing body. Any species wishing to establish relations with human space would need to negotiate bilateral agreements completely separate from Council authority. The Altarian Defense Grid suffered its first major failure when orbital platforms began falling out of synchronization. Human engineers had designed the coordination software that kept hundreds of defensive satellites working together. Without regular updates and maintenance, the system was degrading into useless scrap metal. Enemy raiders who had avoided Altarian space for generations began probing their borders with increasing boldness. Medical crises cascaded across Council territory as the full scope of human contributions became clear. Dr. Warren's research had revolutionized treatment for genetic disorders that affected multiple species. Her work on cellular regeneration had eliminated dozens of diseases that had plagued galactic civilization for millennia. Now children were dying from conditions that their parents had never worried about. Trade Minister Zorketh watched commodity prices spiral into chaos as supply chains completely collapsed. Human agricultural technology had increased food production by orders of magnitude on worlds that could barely sustain life. Atmospheric processors that maintained breathable air on marginal colonies were breaking down without replacement filters. Terraforming equipment that had transformed dead rocks into garden worlds sat idle without human technical expertise. The smaller Council species began quietly reaching out to humanity through back-channel communications. The Valerian Confederacy had always maintained friendly relations with Earth and now found themselves completely cut off from vital trade relationships. Their ambassador requested permission to negotiate independent agreements that would bypass Council authority entirely. Supreme Councillor Mordan faced increasing pressure as the political coalition that had dominated the Council for centuries began fracturing. Species that had voted against helping the Kalari were now experiencing the consequences of their decision. The Zephyrian Empire remained defiant, but even they were beginning to feel the economic impact of losing human industrial capacity. The Kalari integration into human society proceeded with remarkable success despite the challenges involved. Elder Silandros worked closely with human terraforming specialists to modify entire worlds for his people's unique requirements. Kalari bioengineering knowledge, combined with human technology, produced breakthrough innovations that surpassed anything achieved in council space. Counselor Thelvanus reviewed intelligence reports about the growing human alliance that was forming, beyond council borders. 3 species had already formally withdrawn from the council to join humanity's new coalition. Their territories had immediately gained access to human technology and defensive support. Their economies were thriving while council space descended into chaos and violence. The Pentarian government faced violent riots as unemployment reached critical levels. Entire cities had been built around processing facilities for human goods. When those industries disappeared overnight, millions of beings found themselves without work or hope. The Trade Federation's ruling council struggled to maintain order as their economy collapsed around them. Military conflicts erupted across council space as aggressive species exploited the power vacuum left by humanity's withdrawal. The Zephyrians launched new invasion campaigns against weakened neighbors. Pirate fleets that had been suppressed by human patrols now operated with impunity. Trade wars escalated into shooting wars as desperate governments fought over dwindling resources. Dr. Warren's former colleagues in the Council Medical Research Network sent desperate pleas for information about ongoing projects. Cancer treatments that had been in final testing phases were now impossible to complete without human expertise. Epidemic response protocols that had prevented galactic pandemics required constant updates that only human scientists could provide. The jump gate network continued deteriorating as human-trained technicians were no longer available to perform critical maintenance. Gates that had operated flawlessly for decades began developing timing errors that stranded ships in deep space. Some routes became completely impassable as navigation beacons failed without proper upkeep. Supreme Counselor Mordan finally admitted, privately, that the Council had made a catastrophic error in dismissing human concerns. The species they had considered too emotional to participate in serious governance had been holding galactic civilization together through their technical expertise and moral leadership. Without them, the entire system was collapsing into barbarism and chaos. The Altarian Republic formally requested emergency assistance from the Human Alliance after their defensive grid suffered a complete failure. Counselor Thelvanus swallowed his pride and acknowledged that his government could no longer protect its own citizens without outside help. The response from human space was polite but firm. Any assistance would require leaving the council permanently. Trade Minister Zorketh presented final economic projections that showed complete civilizational collapse within 2 years if current trends continued. The council had lost over half of its industrial capacity when humanity departed. Their technological base was degrading rapidly without human research and development. Most critically, they had lost the moral authority that had held the alliance together for centuries. Smaller species began abandoning the council in growing numbers as they sought to join the human alliance or negotiate independent relationships with Earth. The promise of stability and prosperity in human space looked increasingly attractive compared to the chaos and violence spreading through council territory. Mordan realized that the galaxy's balance of power had shifted permanently. Humanity had not simply left the council, they had taken the future with them. The civilization that had dismissed human compassion as weakness was now discovering that strength without moral purpose led only to destruction and despair. 2 years had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. Director Alex Norton stood before the assembled representatives of the Human Independent Alliance and felt pride swell in his chest as he looked out at beings from 23 different species. The conference hall on New Geneva Station buzzed with languages and dialects from across known space as former council members who had chosen principle over politics gathered to plan their shared future. Captain Maya Chen commanded the HSS Defiance as it patrolled the outer boundaries of Alliance space. Her ship represented the pinnacle of human Kalari cooperation with bioadaptive armor that could reshape itself in response to incoming weapons fire. The crystalline components grown by Kalari engineers merged seamlessly with human quantum processing systems to create vessels that were decades ahead of anything still operating in Council territory. Ambassador Greg Foster reviewed applications from 5 more species requesting admission to the Human Alliance. The requirements were simple but absolute. Renounce territorial aggression, commit to mutual defense of all member worlds, and uphold basic rights for sentient beings regardless of their origin or capabilities. Species that had spent centuries exploiting weaker neighbors found these conditions impossible to accept. The Kalari had become humanity's closest partners in ways that surprised both species. Elder Silandros worked alongside human scientists in research facilities that would have been impossible under Council restrictions. Their bioengineering techniques, combined with human nanotechnology, produced medical breakthroughs that eliminated diseases affecting multiple Alliance species. Injured beings who would have died under Council medical care now made full recoveries in Alliance hospitals. Director Norton announced the completion of the Prometheus Gate network during the Alliance Assembly session. The new Jump Gate system connected all Alliance worlds with travel times that were half of what the old Council network had achieved. More importantly, the gates were completely independent of any infrastructure remaining in Council space. Alliance ships could travel freely while Council vessels found themselves increasingly isolated. Captain Chen received distress calls from Council space almost daily as various species faced military threats they could not handle alone. The Zephyrian Empire continued expanding its territory through conquest and genocide. Pirate fleets operated with impunity in regions that had once been safe for civilian traffic. The Council's military response was hampered by equipment failures and lack of coordination between member species. The economic prosperity of Alliance space stood in stark contrast to the chaos spreading through Council territory. Human agricultural technology ensured that no Alliance world faced food shortages. Kalari atmospheric processors maintained perfect environmental conditions on even the most marginal colonies. Trade flowed freely through space that was protected by joint defense fleets equipped with the most advanced weapons in known space. Ambassador Foster met with representatives from the Vorlak Confederacy who had secretly approached the Alliance about potential membership. Their homeworld was under threat from Zephyrian expansion, and the Council had refused to provide adequate protection. The Vorlaks were willing to abandon their Council membership if they could gain Alliance defensive guarantees. Maya Chen's tactical displays showed the true scope of Alliance military superiority as her fleet conducted training exercises with Kalari bioships. The living vessels could regenerate damage in real time, while their human-designed weapon systems delivered firepower that exceeded anything in Council arsenals. Alliance naval doctrine emphasized speed and precision over the brute force tactics that dominated Council military thinking. The research stations scattered throughout Alliance space produced technological innovations at a rate that would have been impossible under Council oversight. Dr. Warren's team had developed universal medical nanites that could treat any known biological injury or disease. Human Kalari joint projects created terraforming systems that could transform dead worlds into garden paradises within months instead of decades. Director Norton reviewed intelligence reports about the deteriorating situation in Council space with mixed feelings. 3 major wars were currently raging as aggressive species exploited the power vacuum left by failed governance. Refugee crises mounted as civilian populations fled violence that the Council seemed unable or unwilling to stop. The body that had once claimed moral authority over galactic civilization was proving incapable of protecting its own members. Captain Chen responded to another distress call from a Council transport under pirate attack near the border between Alliance and Council space. Her orders were clear. Render assistance to any vessels in distress regardless of their political affiliation. The pirates fled when Alliance warships appeared, but not before stealing critical medical supplies intended for Council refugee camps. The integration of new alliance members proceeded smoothly, as human administrative systems proved capable of accommodating virtually any species. Worlds that had struggled with environmental challenges for generations found solutions in alliance technology. Colonies that had barely survived on the margins of Council space flourished under alliance protection and support. Ambassador Foster signed the treaty admitting the Kalaran Republic to the Human Alliance as their 17th member species. The former Council world had endured Zephyrian raids for months while waiting for protection that never came. Within weeks of joining the Alliance, their borders were secured by joint defense fleets, and their damaged infrastructure was being rebuilt with advanced technology. Elder Silandros addressed the Alliance Assembly about the remarkable transformation his people had experienced since joining humanity. Kalari population centers that had been reduced to ash were now thriving cities that merged organic architecture with human engineering. His species had not only survived genocide, but had emerged stronger and more prosperous than ever before. Maya. Chen received classified briefings about Council military capabilities that painted a picture of systematic decline. Equipment failures plagued every major fleet as maintenance became impossible without human technical support. Training programs had collapsed because human military advisors were no longer available. Morale problems affected forces that could no longer protect the civilians they served. The Alliance announcement of new colonial expansion sent shockwaves through Council space. Humanity had discovered resource-rich systems beyond the galactic rim that were completely outside Council territorial claims. Alliance expeditions were establishing settlements at a rate that exceeded the historical expansion of all Council species combined. Director Norton presided over Alliance Council sessions where former enemies worked together as equal partners. Species that had fought border wars for centuries now cooperated on joint research projects. The Alliance Constitution enshrined principles that the Council had abandoned: protection of the weak, support for those in need, and justice regardless of political convenience. Captain Chen's patrol routes took her through space lanes that had once been major Council trade arteries. The routes were nearly empty now as merchant traffic had collapsed along with the infrastructure that supported it. Abandoned space stations drifted as monuments to an economic system that had prioritized profit over sustainability. The Alliance achieved something that Council space had never managed: true peace between member species. Conflicts were resolved through mediation rather than warfare. Resources were shared based on need rather than political influence. Scientific discoveries benefited all members equally instead of being hoarded by the most powerful civilizations. Ambassador. Foster reviewed applications from 3 more Council species seeking Alliance membership. The exodus was accelerating as even major powers began to understand that their future lay with humanity rather than the failing Council system. The species that had once dismissed human emotion as weakness were discovering that compassion and justice created stronger foundations than fear and domination. 5 years after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, the once mighty institution faced complete dissolution. Elder diplomat James Murphy watched from his office on Earth as yet another Council species formally announced its intention to join the Human Alliance. The hegemony itself was fragmenting as member worlds chose independence over continued association with a government that could no longer protect them. President Karen Walsh reviewed the intelligence briefings that painted a picture of civilizational collapse across former Council space. More than half of the original member species had either joined the Alliance or declared complete independence. The remaining Council territory was divided by active war zones and failed states. Refugee populations numbered in the billions as entire species fled violence that their former protectors seemed unable to stop. Fleet Admiral Carl Mitchell commanded Alliance forces that now patrolled space lanes extending far beyond their original borders. Former Council worlds requested protection on an almost daily basis, as their own defensive capabilities proved inadequate against growing threats. Alliance fleets had become the only reliable source of security in a galaxy where law and order had largely collapsed. Supreme Counselor Mordan arrived at Earth with the largest diplomatic delegation in Council history. His entourage included representatives from every remaining member species, plus several that had already announced their intention to leave. The desperation was obvious in their willingness to travel to human space after years of refusing even basic diplomatic contact. The delegation's ships were antiquated compared to Alliance vessels that escorted them through human territory. Council. Technology had stagnated without access to human research and development. Their jump drives were slower and less reliable. Their defensive systems were decades behind Alliance standards. Even their life support system seemed primitive compared to human Kalari bioadaptive technology. President Walsh received the delegation in the same conference room where humanity had first announced its withdrawal from galactic politics 5 years earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone present, as former council leaders who had dismissed human concerns now found themselves begging for assistance. The balance of power had shifted so completely that the meeting felt like a historical curiosity. Mordan presented an offer that would have been unthinkable during humanity's council membership. Complete human control over foreign policy decisions, permanent veto power over all legislation, expanded territorial rights throughout former council space, leadership positions in every major committee and administrative body. The terms represented total surrender of council sovereignty to human authority. James Murphy listened to the proposal with the patience of someone who had spent decades in diplomatic service. The offers were comprehensive and might have been attractive to humanity 5 years earlier. Now they seemed irrelevant given the Alliance's complete independence and growing power. The Council was trying to trade authority they no longer possessed for protection they desperately needed. Elder Silandros accompanied the human delegation as a symbol of what the Council had failed to protect. His presence was a living reminder of the genocide that had prompted humanity's withdrawal. The Kalari leader's graceful bearing and obvious health stood in sharp contrast to the desperate exhaustion visible in the Council. Representatives' faces. President Walsh posed the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Where had the Council been when the Kalari faced extinction? The silence that followed was deafening as Mordan struggled to justify decisions that had seemed politically expedient at the time. The cost of those choices now stretched across a galaxy torn apart by violence and chaos. The Alliance had grown far beyond anything the Council had ever achieved. 31 species now work together in genuine partnership based on shared principles, rather than political convenience. Their combined territory exceeded the old Council space, while their technological capabilities surpassed anything in known history. More importantly, they had created a civilization based on justice and compassion rather than exploitation and domination. Fleet Admiral Mitchell's reports showed Alliance military strength that dwarfed the combined forces remaining under Council control. Alliance ships were not only more advanced, but operated with coordination and purpose that reflected shared commitment to common goals. Council forces remained fragmented by competing national interests and equipment incompatibilities. Dr. Warren's medical research had eliminated diseases that had plagued galactic civilization for millennia. Alliance hospitals treated patients from across known space, including many refugees from Council territory. The universal healthcare system that humanity had proposed years earlier was now reality in Alliance space, while Council worlds faced medical crises they could not solve. Mordan made his final plea with the desperation of someone watching his civilization crumble. He offered to dissolve the Council entirely and place all remaining territory under human administration. The proposal represented complete admission that Council governance had failed beyond any possibility of reform. Yet even total surrender seemed inadequate to address the scope of damage that decades of corruption had created. President Walsh delivered humanity's response with quiet finality that left no room for negotiation. the Alliance had no interest in governing unwilling subjects or managing territories torn apart by violence. They were committed to building something better rather than trying to repair something that had been fundamentally broken from the beginning. The President's words carried the weight of human experience over 5 years of alliance building. They had learned that sustainable peace required more than military power or economic prosperity. It demanded shared commitment to principles that placed justice above convenience and compassion above profit. The Council had proven incapable of such commitment. James Murphy added his own perspective as someone who had spent his career trying to work within the Council system. The damage went beyond failed policies or military defeats. The Council had lost the moral authority necessary to govern a diverse galactic civilization. Trust, once broken, could not be restored through administrative reforms or constitutional changes. Elder Silandros spoke for the final time to representatives of the government that had abandoned his people to genocide. His words were measured, but carried the weight of entire species that had suffered while the Council debated political consequences. The Kalari had found new life and purpose within the Alliance that would have been impossible under Council rule. The Council delegation departed Earth with the understanding that their former position as galactic leaders was permanently ended. Some member species would continue struggling to maintain independence in an increasingly chaotic galaxy. Others would apply for Alliance membership and accept the moral standards that such partnership required. President Walsh watched the alien ships disappear into hyperspace and felt no satisfaction in their defeat. The collapse of Council civilization represented tragedy for billions of beings caught in the violence and chaos that followed governmental failure. Yet the alternative of working within a corrupt system would have compromised the principles that made the Alliance possible. Fleet Admiral Mitchell received reports of 3 more Council species requesting emergency assistance as Zephyrian forces continued their expansion campaign. Alliance policy was clear. Humanitarian aid would be provided to civilian populations, but military intervention required formal Alliance membership. The choice facing each species was simple but absolute. The galaxy had been transformed by humanity's decision to walk away from political compromise and moral flexibility. The Alliance represented proof that sustainable civilization required more than technological advancement or military power. It demanded commitment to principles that many species found difficult to accept, but which had proven essential for lasting peace. 5 years after the Council had dismissed human concerns as too emotional, the galaxy faced a new reality. Emotion, guided by moral principle, had proven stronger than calculation, guided by political convenience. The species that had valued profit over justice now faced the consequences of their choices, while those who chose compassion over convenience built a better future among the stars.